Outside, the icy wind howled and danced through the treetops, as snowflakes silently descended, blanketing the world in white. Inside, Shen Anyu cradled her drowsy daughter, her eyes repeatedly darting towards the clock on the wall. A heart-shaped cake sat undisturbed on the dining table, 4 candles already placed, waiting for the moment to be lit. Time ticked by, each second dragging on. Yaoyao tugged at Shen Anyu's sleeve. "Mommy, will Daddy come home?" Shen Anyu stroked her daughter's head, her voice soft and soothing. "Daddy might be busy with something." "Be good, why don't you go to your room to sleep? As soon as Daddy comes home, Mommy will wake you, okay?" The light in Yaoyao's eyes slowly dimmed. Although she was only 4 years old, she possessed a level of understanding far beyond her age, a consequence of her parents' increasingly strained relationship. "Okay, I'll do what Mommy says." She slid off the sofa, removed her wig, revealing her small bald head, and walked towards her room, her head hung low in dejection. Shen Anyu watched her daughter's fragile figure, a sharp, suffocating pain tearing at her heart. This was her 5th year of marriage to Lu Chen. Before they married, she and Lu Chen had shared a period of blissful, love-filled days. But ever since their daughter was diagnosed with leukemia, his attitude towards her and their child had drastically changed. She knew, he didn't want the burden. However, Yaoyao was the daughter she had carried for 10 months. Each time she looked into those innocent eyes, a strong sense of resolve surged through her. She absolutely refused to abandon her daughter. The winter wind howled, the streets covered in thick snow. When Lu Chen returned, bringing with him a chill of ice and snow, Shen Anyu was cleaning the table. The happy sheep cake on the table had begun to melt. Shen Anyu forced a smile. "You're home late, I had Yaoyao go to sleep first." Lu Chen snorted, clearly showing no remorse for missing his daughter's birthday. Shen Anyu didn't have time to argue with him, she had something more important to do. After quickly clearing the dishes, she went up to her bedroom, showered, and changed into the new lingerie she had bought. She knew Lu Chen didn't like her plainness, so she had specially bought a sexy, revealing set, hoping to please him. After drying her hair, she lightly sprayed some perfume onto her collarbone and cautiously entered the bedroom. The man lay in bed, eyes closed, seemingly already asleep. Suppressing her shame, Shen Anyu climbed onto the bed and slipped under the covers. The slight movement under the blanket ignited something within Lu Chen. A nameless anger spread through him, and he opened his eyes. The next second, he sat up and, grabbing her chin, harshly said, "Shen Anyu, are you really this cheap?" Shen Anyu's clothes were disheveled. Hearing Lu Chen's question, her heart clenched, as if she had been slapped. Her gaze drifted to his neck, where a kiss mark left by another woman was clearly visible. Shen Anyu's shoulders drooped slightly, as if she were bearing an unbearable pain. She closed her eyes, deeply burying the pain within her, and gently took his arm with her hands, her voice pleading, "Aiken, let's have another child." Another child. Their umbilical cord blood could save Yaoyao from leukemia. Lu Chen looked at her with a sneer, forcefully pushing her away and getting out of bed. "Want to save that bastard? You're dreaming." His words were like a sharp knife, stabbing deep into Shen Anyu's heart. The next second, he turned and left without hesitation. Shen Anyu stared at his retreating figure, the hope in her eyes fading with each step. Despair, like a cold tide, washed over her, reaching every nerve in her body. In the silent room, a cold, mechanical system voice echoed in her mind. "Target's favorability has decreased to 60%. Host, would you like to leave this world?" The system's cold tone left Shen Anyu stunned. 5 years ago, it had confidently declared success in capture. At that time, she had thought everything was settled. However, with Yaoyao's birth, Lu Chen's favorability towards her had been on an unstoppable downward spiral. And now, it had even fallen to 60%. Shen Anyu's eyes were slightly red, and she asked with difficulty, "Why?" The system showed Lu Chen's emotional index. One half was a slightly shorter warm color, while the other was a longer, cold color. On the warm side, Yi Qingqing's name was written, bright and dazzling. On the cold side, however, Shen Anyu's name was blurry and indistinct. Shen Anyu lowered her head, tears silently tracing paths down her cheeks. The mechanical voice sounded again, "You can also choose to return to your original world." Should she leave? Shen Anyu asked herself internally. At this moment of decision, she thought of Yaoyao again. This was the child she had carried for 10 months. If she left, who would save Yaoyao? Shen Anyu shook her head. "No, I can't leave." The system's cold voice stated, "Favorability has fallen below 60%. A mandatory departure sequence will be activated. Host, please be vigilant and capture with caution." The system's voice disappeared. Shen Anyu lay weakly on the bed. She turned to look at the snowflakes falling outside the window. This winter, the weather was freezing, and it felt as if her heart had also been hit by a devastating snowstorm. The next morning, Shen Anyu took Yaoyao to the hospital for a checkup. Yaoyao's leukemia, because they hadn't been able to find a suitable match, could only be treated conservatively. From the 15th day of chemotherapy, her hair had started to fall out at an alarming rate, becoming thinner each day. Later, she had simply shaved the child's head and bought her a wig. After the checkup, the doctor gave her the same advice as before: "We still haven't found a match. I still recommend you and your husband have a second child as soon as possible." The umbilical cord blood of a second child had a high probability of being able to save Yaoyao. But Shen Anyu thought of Lu Chen's cold cynicism last night, and it felt like she had swallowed a mouthful of needles. We'll consider it," she replied, before taking Yaoyao to the infusion room. Yaoyao suddenly tugged at her clothes and pointed to the distance. "Mommy, is that Daddy?" Shen Anyu followed her daughter's gaze. At the entrance of the obstetrics and gynecology department, Lu Chen was walking out with Yi Qingqing, both of them holding checkup forms. A gust of wind blew by, and Lu Chen reached out to brush away the hair that had fallen across Yi Qingqing's temple, his expression carrying a tenderness that Shen Anyu had never seen before. At that moment, Shen Anyu felt a sharp pain in her heart, but she didn't forget to pick up her daughter and turn her around, preventing her from seeing such a scene. "No, Yaoyao must have seen someone who just looks like Daddy." Her voice was hoarse as she soothed her child, "They just looked a little similar." "Really?" Yaoyao asked in her childish voice. "Really?" Shen Anyu suppressed her tears and quickly turned, taking Yaoyao to the infusion room. When it was time for the injection, she covered her child's eyes, while the doctor inserted the needle into the vein. Yaoyao was very well behaved and no longer cried when getting her shots. However, the physiological reaction was impossible to suppress. Just half a bottle into the infusion, Yaoyao suddenly began to vomit. The egg and sweet potato she had eaten that morning were all brought up, leaving a mess on the floor. The nurses and hospital cleaners were accustomed to these scenes and quickly cleaned up the mess. Shen Anyu held her child tightly, her heart aching. "Yaoyao, bear with it for a bit, it will be over soon." Yaoyao wrapped her arms around her neck, whimpering softly, like an undernourished kitten whose cries were barely audible. "If only Daddy could be here with me," Yaoyao whispered in her ear. Shen Anyu's heart felt like it was being torn apart, a mixture of guilt, helplessness, and deep sorrow flooding her senses. Her fingertips trembled slightly. She told her daughter, "Yaoyao, Mommy will call Daddy and ask him to come and keep you company, okay?" Yaoyao obediently let go of her mother and looked at her with eyes full of hope. "Mommy, go quickly." Shen Anyu left the infusion room, her hands trembling as she took out her phone. Before she could dial, she saw Lu Chen and Yi Qingqing waiting around the corner. She rushed over. "Aiken, Yaoyao is getting an infusion right now." She tried to hide the tears in her eyes, her voice trembling slightly. "Can you, please come and be with her?" Lu Chen looked up at her. "That bastard, it's her fault that she's sick." "What does that have to do with me?" Shen Anyu looked at him in disbelief. She couldn't believe that such callous words could come out of her child's father's mouth. "Lu Chen, Yaoyao is your daughter, how can you treat her like this?" Lu Chen looked at her with a sneer, and put his arm around Yi Qingqing's shoulder. "This one in Qingqing's belly is my child." Shen Anyu's heart was in agony. She hadn't expected Lu Chen to be so cruel. For Yi Qingqing, he could abandon his own biological daughter. She remembered when she first became pregnant with Yaoyao, he would lie next to her belly every day, listening for the child's movements. He had chosen a nickname for the child, called Yaoyao. He had been so excited for the child's arrival. But now, he abandoned the sick Yaoyao like a worn-out shoe. Yi Qingqing touched Lu Chen's hand, looking gentle and understanding. "Aiken, I can manage on my own, why don't you go see Yaoyao?" "I'm not a doctor, what good would it do if I went?" Lu Chen's cold and callous words caused Shen Anyu to take a step back. She clutched her chest, her heart aching so badly that she could barely breathe. She looked at Lu Chen, and his current appearance was beginning to overlap with the Lu Chen who accompanied her to the hospital for a checkup 5 years ago. However, she was no longer the most important person in his eyes. "Miss Shen, since Aiken doesn't want to go, then don't force him," Yi Qingqing said with a slight curl of her lips. "You should just go be with your child." Shen Anyu understood that any further attempt would only bring further humiliation. She returned to the infusion room. Yaoyao was sitting in the big blue chair, the back of her thin hand marked with purple and blue needle punctures. When she saw her return, she looked behind her. "Mommy, will Daddy come see me?" Shen Anyu was taken aback. She managed a smile. "Daddy has to work, he'll come to see you next time, okay?" Yaoyao was terribly disappointed. She continued to get the infusion, whimpering softly. By the end, she had cried so much, she just fell asleep out of exhaustion. Shen Anyu looked at her, her heart breaking. After finally finishing the infusion, she took her daughter home. Remembering the doctor's advice, her heart felt cold and desolate. The doctor had told her to have a second child with her husband as soon as possible. This was the solution that many families with children suffering from leukemia resorted to. Firstly, there was a very high probability that the umbilical cord blood of a second child could be a successful match with the firstborn. Secondly, even if the matching failed and the child passed away, the couple would still have another child to give their lives new hope. Shen Anyu wanted to save Yaoyao, she was willing to pay any price. But Lu Chen was obviously unwilling. He only saw the child, and her, as a burden. In the evening, the winter sunset streamed through the French windows into the room, but brought no warmth. Shen Anyu carefully placed her sleeping daughter on the bed and gently closed the door to the children's room. Suddenly, there was a noise in the entryway. Shen Anyu looked over. Lu Chen came in, wearing a black wool coat, and holding a brown paper document folder. He looked stern and cold. Memories flooded her mind, reminding her of the time when she and Lu Chen were newlyweds. Back then, every time he left for work, he would ask for a goodbye kiss, and every time he returned home, he would smile, arms wide open, wanting to embrace her. That beautiful and passionate past had vanished into ashes, she didn't even know when it had started to disappear. Lu Chen walked into the living room and placed the document on the table, his tone icily cold. "Shen Anyu, let's get a divorce." Shen Anyu was stunned for a moment. Divorce? Lu Chen actually wanted a divorce from her? Lu Chen spoke in an indifferent tone. "Qingqing is pregnant, my child cannot be without a father." His words were like sharp blades, leaving her utterly wounded. Her child cannot be without a father, what about Yaoyao? Can Yaoyao not have a father? She asked the ruthless man in front of her, her voice choked with emotion as tears welled in her eyes. But Lu Chen was not moved by her tears. He pointed to the agreement on the table. "Take a look at it, if there are no problems, just sign it." Shen Anyu's gaze moved to the document on the table. The 5 large characters, "Divorce Agreement," on the title, pierced her eyes. At this moment, all the emotions she had been suppressing finally crumbled. "Lu Chen, all these years, have you ever really loved me?" Once, she had believed in that answer with all her heart. For that love, she had given up the chance to return to her original world. For that love, she risked her life to give birth to Yaoyao. But now, he was making her think that his so-called love was nothing but a lie. If he had ever truly loved her, how could he be so cold and heartless? What's the point of talking about that now? Lu Chen turned his head away, his voice firm, sign it. For the sake of our time as a couple, I won't be unfair to you or your daughter. Your daughter. Shen Anyu was deeply wounded by those two words. She couldn't help but ask him, isn't Yaoyao your daughter too? How can you treat her like this? Lu Chen scoffed, whether or not she's my daughter, you know best. After speaking, he turned and left without hesitation. Daddy. Shen Anyu heard Yaoyao's voice from behind her. She quickly hugged her daughter. Lu Chen looked back for a second. His cold gaze swept over his daughter, not showing the slightest hint of pity or love. In that moment, Shen Anyu even wondered if the man who used to change her daughter's diapers and let her ride on his shoulders was just a figment of her imagination. Yaoyao's voice was already filled with sobs. She reached her hands out to Lu Chen, Daddy, hug. She had felt her father's genuine and selfless love before, so she subconsciously wanted to snuggle up to him. However, Lu Chen did not respond to her. He just walked decisively towards the door and closed it behind him. Behind him, Yaoyao wailed in despair. Shen Anyu held her daughter, patting her on the back. Baby, don't cry, Daddy's rushing to work, he didn't mean to not hug you. Mommy, does Daddy not like me anymore? Yaoyao cried until she was hiccuping, crying even more intensely than when she had been given an injection at the hospital. Is it because I'm sick that Daddy doesn't want me anymore? Shen Anyu soothed her daughter for a long time. Only after Yaoyao was worn out from crying did she finally fall asleep. She initially breathed a sigh of relief and lay down next to her daughter's bed. However, in the middle of the night, Yaoyao suddenly started to whimper softly. Shen Anyu, who was only sleeping lightly, heard her daughter's cries. Drowsily, she reached out to pat her back and coax her back to sleep. However, when she touched her, the heat on her hand instantly jolted her awake. Yaoyao's body was burning hot, her small face flushed crimson. Shen Anyu's heart sank. She took her daughter to the provincial people's hospital late at night. The doctor took her directly from the emergency room into a ward, and immediately started the infusion to reduce her temperature. Shen Anyu had looked after her daughter throughout the night, becoming so worn out that she looked like she would collapse any second. And yet, at this very moment, she encountered Yi Qingqing. Yi Qingqing, dressed in a slightly loose long dress, was glowing. She blocked Shen Anyu's path, and spoke softly, Miss Shen, I want to talk to you. Shen Anyu walked with her to the hallway beside the ward. Her gaze briefly fell on the huge diamond ring on Yi Qingqing's ring finger. It was the same style that she had wanted years ago, but which Lu Chen couldn't afford. Now that he was successful, he had bought the ring that she could only stare at through the shop window, and given it to someone else. Yi Qingqing also noticed her gaze, and openly held out her hand with the ring to show her. Her expression was full of smug satisfaction. Miss Shen, Aiken has already proposed to me. She said matter-of-factly to Shen Anyu, I hope that you can sign the divorce agreement as soon as possible, so that you don't delay Aiken and my wedding. Shen Anyu didn't understand why the woman in front of her could say such things with such ease. She accused Yi Qingqing, you're the one who broke up my family. Yi Qingqing touched her belly, her tone filled with smugness, it's not me who broke up your family, it's you who couldn't keep your own man. Shen Anyu looked at her young and beautiful face, and was at a loss for words. Back then, when I had just graduated from university, I would work overtime in the company until late at night. Aiken would accompany me every day and then send me home. Yi Qingqing began to talk about her past with Lu Chen. Shen Anyu turned her head away, interrupting Yi Qingqing, I don't want to listen. She didn't want to hear about the experiences and details of Lu Chen's love with another woman. But Yi Qingqing wouldn't let her get her way. Miss Shen, at that time the company was already stable, Aiken, as the boss, didn't really need to work overtime until late every day. Yi Qingqing asked her meaningfully, do you know why Aiken preferred to stay in the company rather than go home? Shen Anyu looked at her sharply, the answer in her heart was something that she didn't want to face. Yi Qingqing parted her lips lightly, because he didn't want to go home, he didn't want to see you. Those words were like a sharp blade, piercing deeply into Shen Anyu's heart. In an instant, she was bleeding profusely, the pain almost killing her. Yi Qingqing still maintained that gentle appearance, the corners of her lips curving into a soft smile. "I've come to find you today, to tell you that Lu Chen hasn't loved you for a long time, so stop clinging to him." Having said that, she turned and left. Shen Anyu remained standing where she was. The cold winter wind blew through the hallway, making her shiver. Like a candle that had burned down to the end, she looked dazed as she returned to the ward. The doctor rushed over to find her, telling her, "Yaoyao's mom, we found a match for your daughter. Come with me." Shen Anyu was so stunned by this tremendous surprise that she couldn't speak. She subconsciously wanted to share this good news with Lu Chen, but when her fingers touched the phone, she remembered the words that Yi Qingqing had just said to her. Would Lu Chen really think this was such great news, like she did? She suddenly wasn't sure. The doctor led her to the consultation room and explained the details of the match to her. "I suggest that you prepare the surgical costs as soon as possible, and also, regarding the bone marrow donor, they have requested some compensation." Finding a matching bone marrow for leukemia was already a huge stroke of luck. Shen Anyu didn't hesitate for a moment and agreed immediately. Then she took her bank card to pay the fees. Her daughter's surgery had used up all of the savings she had accumulated over the years. She couldn't afford the compensation requested by the donor. Shen Anyu sat on the hospital bench, scrolling through the contact list on her phone. Over the years, she had resigned from her job at home, spending all her time with Yaoyao at various hospitals, and had long since lost contact with all of her friends. Her company shares, house and car were all in Lu Chen's name, and she had no way of turning them into cash. When push came to shove, she had nowhere else to turn but to call Lu Chen. The phone rang for a long time before it was finally picked up. "Aiken, can you come home for a bit?" Shen Anyu asked with a worried heart. Lu Chen scoffed, "What for? What tricks are you trying to pull now?" His tone was filled with impatience, like he was talking to a bothersome burden. Shen Anyu's heart sank to the bottom of her stomach. Originally, she had wanted to share the joy of finding the donor with him, but at that moment, it all seemed meaningless. He now had a new woman, a new child. Why would he care about her and Yaoyao's life or death? Shen Anyu opened her mouth and used an extremely soft voice to tell him, "Don't you want to divorce me? Tonight, please come to the hospital, I will sign the agreement for you." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the phone. Then, Lu Chen's cold voice came, "Shen Anyu, you better keep your word." After hanging up the phone, Shen Anyu stood by the window. She looked at the gray sky, and her heart was filled with helplessness and despair. Once, Lu Chen's love and care for her had filled her life like sunshine, making her feel like the happiest woman in the world. However, the man he was now was like a cold statue, ruthless and distant. In the evening, Lu Chen rushed to the hospital. Shen Anyu didn't take him into the ward. Instead, they sat in a small garden next to the hospital's inpatient department. Surrounded by a desolate winter landscape, Shen Anyu spoke softly, "Aiken, Yaoyao has found a suitable match, she can get the surgery." As she spoke, she hardened her heart and placed the divorce agreement that she had read countless times on the table. "Give me 5 million and I'll agree to divorce you." 500,000 was for the donor's compensation, the remaining 4.5 million was to provide her daughter with living expenses. When Lu Chen heard the amount, a sneer escaped his throat. "You kept saying that you didn't want to divorce for the sake of love and your child, it seems it was just because you hadn't gotten enough money yet." Shen Anyu felt like she had been slapped. She lifted her head and asked, "Lu Chen, is this the kind of woman you think I am?" Lu Chen glanced at her, the mockery in his eyes plainly showing his attitude. Shen Anyu swallowed all of the humiliation, forcing back the tears that were threatening to spill, and asked, 5 years of love, isn't it even worth 5 million in your eyes?" She had been with him from the very start, helping him build a billion-dollar empire. Now, when it came time for divorce, she only wanted to leave 5 million for her daughter's support, but he wasn't even willing to give her that. The indescribable pain washed over her like a tide. Lu Chen laughed coldly and raised 5 fingers, at most, 500,000. Shen Anyu lowered her head. Her heart had turned cold in an instant. Lu Chen had no more feelings for her. As Yi Qingqing's weight in his heart continued to grow, she would most likely not even reach the 60% favorability threshold. She would be forcibly taken away from this world. As a mother, she had to find a way to cure Yaoyao's illness, at the very least, before she was taken away from this world. She had no time to delay, and Yaoyao's illness couldn't be delayed either. Okay. Shen Anyu's lips trembled slightly, her heart filled with despair. 500,000, it's a deal. Lu Chen clenched his fists. Okay, I'll bring the money over first thing tomorrow morning. He took a deep look at her and resolutely turned away. Shen Anyu, don't regret this. After saying that, he turned and left, afraid to look at her again. This was clearly the result he wanted. But hearing Shen Anyu actually agree to the divorce, he felt like a lump of cotton was stuck in his throat, making it hard to breathe. Shen Anyu sat in the cold winter wind for a while, alone, digesting the grief that was churning within her. At that moment, she suddenly received a system notification. Host. Target's favorability is continuing to decline. It's currently at 59, 58, 57. Finally, the favorability stopped at 55, which was lower than the minimum required for her to stay in this world. She asked the system in her mind, how long can I stay? The cold system voice replied, if the favorability does not increase, you can only stay for 3 months at the most. Shen Anyu felt a wave of despair. Returning to the ward, she looked at her sleeping daughter, and an unbearable sadness overwhelmed her. Holding her daughter, she didn't sleep a wink all night. The next morning, she heard someone knocking on the door of the ward. Assuming it was Lu Chen, she hurried to open the door. However, the person standing in front of the open ward door was her college senior, Jiang Yiheng. Senior, what are you doing here? Shen Anyu looked at him in surprise, weren't you abroad? Jiang Yiheng smiled, I just came back to the country a few days ago. I heard that your daughter was hospitalized, so I came to visit. Back then, Jiang Yiheng had also had leukemia, and had chosen to go abroad for treatment, where he had remained for several years. Later, he had been cured and continued his further studies. Shen Anyu was very happy to see him now. Jiang Yiheng sat in the ward, chatting with Yaoyao, telling her about his experiences with treatment, and encouraged her with a smile, Yaoyao, don't worry, you'll get cured just like your uncle. Yaoyao smiled sweetly at him. Shen Anyu was sitting on the side peeling an apple, and gratefully looked at Jiang Yiheng after hearing his words. The atmosphere inside the room was very warm, but that peace was suddenly broken by someone at the door. Lu Chen was standing at the door. Looking at them laughing and chatting, he sneered, Shen Anyu, I wondered why you signed so quickly. His tone was filled with cynicism. He glanced at Jiang Yiheng before glaring at Shen Anyu. So, it's your old flame that's back. Shen Anyu's expression was shocked, what are you talking about? When they were in school, Jiang Yiheng had indeed pursued her. However, her target, the person she had always loved, had always been Lu Chen. She had never looked at anyone else. Lu Chen slowly entered the room, his gaze directed at Jiang Yiheng, filled with open hostility. Jiang Yiheng stood up, his tone serious, Mr. Lu, you are a father, you shouldn't speak like that in front of a child. His gaze swept over Yaoyao. The little girl, burdened by her serious illness, seemed to sense the tension in the room. Her shoulders were hunched, her small face pale, making her look pitiful and vulnerable. Lu Chen's anger only intensified. He grabbed Jiang Yiheng by his collar, now you suddenly care? Back then, when you left the country, wasn't your departure very carefree? Shen Anyu felt a prick of unease at his sarcastic words, a subconscious feeling that something was not right. But seeing her daughter's increasingly pale face, she didn't have time to think too much. Lu Chen, don't shout in front of the child. She stroked her daughter's head, her eyes red as she admonished him, don't frighten her. Yaoyao nestled into Shen Anyu's arms. Hearing her mother's words, she peeked out, reaching her hands out to Lu Chen. "Daddy, don't be angry, Yaoyao won't talk to him anymore." As she spoke, Yaoyao glanced at Jiang Yiheng. Even though she had enjoyed chatting with this uncle, in Yaoyao's eyes, her mother and father were the most important people. Jiang Yiheng sighed, but didn't want to argue with a child. Shen Anyu offered him an apologetic smile. "Senior, I'm so sorry." Jiang Yiheng shook his head. He freed himself from Lu Chen's grip and, looking somber, said to Shen Anyu, "I'll be going now, I'll come visit Yaoyao again another day." After Jiang Yiheng left, Lu Chen leaned against the wall, his face still a scowl. At this moment, the doctor came over to administer Yaoyao's infusion. Shen Anyu first held the child, allowing the doctor to insert the needle, and then she walked over to Lu Chen, gently tugging on his sleeve. "Let's go outside and talk." Her voice was soft, laced with a subtle, almost imperceptible sorrow. But Lu Chen, consumed by anger, didn't notice. Leaving the ward, Shen Anyu realized that Yi Qingqing had also come today, waiting by the door. When Lu Chen saw Yi Qingqing, he went to her quickly. "Why were you waiting by the door? Aren't you cold?" As he spoke, he touched Yi Qingqing's hand. After sensing that she wasn't cold, he crouched down on one knee, tying her shoelace. Shen Anyu stood to one side, watching his submissive and thoughtful actions, her heart twisting in pain. Once, when she was pregnant with Yaoyao, and unable to bend down due to her large belly, she had asked him to help her tie her shoelaces. At that time, Lu Chen was still young and felt that helping a woman tie her shoelaces in public was too embarrassing. She had begged him, but Lu Chen had outright refused. But now, the treatment that she had once begged and pleaded for was easily offered to another woman. Yi Qingqing pulled him up, speaking to him in a coquettish tone. "I need to go for a checkup, will you come find me later, okay?" Lu Chen nodded. Turning around again, his gaze met Shen Anyu's. Shen Anyu's red-rimmed eyes and wronged expression triggered a subtle satisfaction within him. However, that satisfaction only lasted until Shen Anyu pulled out the divorce agreement. "I've already signed the agreement," Shen Anyu said, her eyes lowered. "You said that you'd give me 500,000 for the divorce." Lu Chen took the divorce agreement, a cold smile curving his lips. "I used that 500,000 to buy a necklace for Qingqing. I'll give it to you later." His casual words were like a sword piercing through Shen Anyu's chest. 500,000 was just an insignificant necklace for Yi Qingqing. But for Yaoyao, it was her chance to live. At this moment, the emotions that had accumulated over time finally erupted. Shen Anyu grabbed Lu Chen's sleeve, looking up at him, her eyes full of anger and despair. "Lu Chen, do you have any humanity left? That's Yaoyao's life-saving money. What does that have to do with me?" Lu Chen stared down at her condescendingly. "Shen Anyu," she said, her voice cracking with sorrow, "Yaoyao is your daughter." Looking at the ruthless man in front of her, she suddenly felt that he was utterly unfamiliar. From when had he become so cold, so cruel? Even his own daughter's life had become a bargaining chip, something to be used as blackmail. Lu Chen scoffed. "Shen Anyu, when you tell lies too many times, you start believing them yourself, right?" Shen Anyu stared at him blankly, not understanding what he was talking about. Lu Chen said coldly, "Do you think I don't know? Yaoyao isn't my daughter at all." "What nonsense are you talking about?" Shen Anyu's face was filled with shock. In an instant, she recalled all of the strange things he had done ever since Yaoyao's birth. So, he had been suspecting that Yaoyao wasn't his child. Lu Chen gritted his teeth. "If I'm not mistaken, she's Jiang Yiheng's child, right? Jiang Yiheng got leukemia, and left the country, leaving you here." He spoke each word with absolute certainty, as if he had seen it with his own eyes. "You married me, carrying that bastard, and then you lied to me, telling me that she was my child." Shen Anyu found it all utterly absurd. Her face flushed red with anger. "Lu Chen, what madness are you spouting? What did I ever lie to you about?" Her jaw was trembling and her fists were tightly clenched. She desperately wanted to bite this man, who was slandering her innocence, to death. If you don't believe me, we can do a paternity test. You think I haven't already done that? Luchan interrupted her. Shen Anyu froze, and looked at Luchan in disbelief. Luchan's eyes were bloodshot, filled with a deep hatred. He remembered how, when Yaoyao was diagnosed with leukemia, he had been the first to participate in the matching process as her father. This was Shen Anyu's child, the crystallization of their love. He would have given her anything, his bone marrow or even his life. But the test results came back and he wasn't a match. Not only that, something else had been revealed. He was not Yaoyao's biological father. That night, holding that thin test report, he felt like his world was falling apart. His family, his children, his dignity as a man, all of it was crushed by that one report. And all of this was caused by the woman in front of him. She had approached him step by step, deceived him, and then married him, carrying another man's child. How could that be possible? Shen Anyu took a step back. She grabbed Luchan's sleeve. It's impossible, the test results must be wrong, Yaoyao is definitely your child. Her anger and panic, in Luchan's eyes, were just a mask she used to get money. Even now, when are you going to stop pretending? He grabbed Shen Anyu's chin, looking at her crying pitiful face, a deep hatred spreading through him. Please believe me, let's do another test, okay, she pleaded as she cried. Stop wasting your time. Luchan sneered, if you want to save that bastard, go find her real father. I will absolutely not give her another penny. After saying that, he suddenly pushed her away, causing her to fall onto the ground, scraping her palm and drawing blood. Luchan didn't show her any pity. Instead, he picked up the divorce agreement from the ground. He warned her coldly, I'll give you 3 days to move out of my house. Shen Anyu lifted her head and looked at him, the despair in her heart spreading silently like frost outside the window. Aiken, we've been married for 5 years. Do you really not have even this much trust in me? Luchan's expression was cold as he looked down at Shen Anyu, husband and wife. You no longer deserve that title. After Luchan left, Shen Anyu sat alone on a bench in the hospital for a long time, struggling to digest the heavy, sticky emotions that were threatening to pull her into the abyss. Then, she put on a smile and continued to take care of Yaoyao. On the eve of the Lunar New Year, she went to the Lu family home alone. Luchan had repeatedly warned her that if she refused to move out, he would throw all of her belongings out. She didn't care about her belongings being thrown out, but she couldn't bear for her daughter's things to be thrown away so ruthlessly. So, while everyone was immersed in the joy of the Lunar New Year Eve, she rented an apartment by herself and then went to her old house to pack up her things. As she entered, a rich aroma of hot pot filled the house. Luchan and Yi Qingqing were sitting at the dining table, and her mother-in-law was busy with setting the table and serving Yi Qingqing. Shen Anyu remembered how, when she was pregnant, her mother-in-law had also taken care of her with such care, saying that she had to give Luchan a son to carry on the family name. Later, Yaoyao was born. When her mother-in-law saw that she had given birth to a daughter, she didn't even stay for a day. She just glanced at the child and then packed up her things and went back to her hometown. Your things are all piled up on the balcony. You should move them out quickly, don't take up space, her mother-in-law said, pointing to the mess of things piled up on the balcony. Shen Anyu didn't say a word, quietly packing everything again. As she was dragging her luggage out, her phone received a message from the hospital asking when they could proceed with Yaoyao's surgery. Yaoyao's condition meant that every extra day was a greater danger to her. But she didn't have enough money. She turned to look at Luchan. Shen Anyu's hand trembled slightly, her eyes red-rimmed, as if she had been pushed to the edge. She walked up to Luchan, one step at a time. Luchan, when you started your company, I gave you 500,000. Can you return that to me now? Luchan lifted his eyelids and glanced at her. Over the years, haven't I given you more than 500,000? Shen Anyu pleaded with him, then just consider it as if I'm borrowing it from you. I can write you an IOU, is that okay? Luchan turned his head away, a mocking smile on his face. Yi Qingqing said sarcastically, Miss Su, you're taking care of a sick child. If Aiken lends you money, how will you repay him in the future? Shen Anyu felt terribly ashamed. But for her daughter, she had no other choice but to beg Lu Chen. Looking at the man's hard, unyielding face, she bit her lip and knelt down in front of Lu Chen. Please, I beg you. Lu Chen stood up abruptly, as if he hadn't expected her to go to such lengths. His lips moved slightly, as if he wanted to say something. However, before he could say anything, his mother interrupted him. What are you doing? His mother grabbed her and pulled her up, pushing her towards the door. You brought this on yourself with bad luck. You gave birth to a sickly child, don't try to drag my son down with you. Shen Anyu was pushed out of the door, watching the door close in front of her eyes. In that moment, the despair in her heart seemed to freeze into ice. Just at this moment, the hospital suddenly called, Yaoyao's mom, you need to come to the hospital quickly, your daughter is in critical condition. Shen Anyu didn't even have time to react, she rushed to the hospital immediately. When she arrived, Yaoyao had already been wheeled into the operating room. The operating room light stayed on all night. Shen Anyu waited outside the operating room, her heart in turmoil. She silently asked herself, where did everything go wrong? How did things get to this point? If she had managed to raise enough money earlier, if she had managed to get the bone marrow transplant for her child earlier, perhaps, Yaoyao wouldn't have had to suffer so much. Time passed, each second dragging on, and as the first ray of dawn lit up the sky, the operating room door opened. Shen Anyu's heart clenched suddenly, and she immediately got up and rushed over. The next second, the doctor's words struck her ears like a thunderbolt. We were not able to save the patient, I'm sorry for your loss. A buzzing sound filled her ears. Shen Anyu felt like she couldn't hear anything after that. Her legs trembling, she moved step by step towards the operating table, which was covered by a white sheet. Lifting the sheet, on the pale operating table, Yaoyao's eyes were closed, as if she was asleep. Shen Anyu reached out and touched her daughter's cold, small face. A tear fell with a soft plop onto her hand. Yaoyao, mommy was too late. She was too late, she didn't even get to see Yaoyao's face one last time. A nurse standing beside them sighed. When she was taken into the operating room, she kept calling for her mother and father. The emotions that Shen Anyu had been suppressing all this time nearly broke down when she heard those words. She wrapped her arms tightly around that small, cold body. This was the daughter she had carried for 10 months, and given birth to with all her strength. She had believed that she would have a healthy body, a happy family, would grow up surrounded by love and sunlight in this world. But in just one night, her Yaoyao was no longer able to open her eyes. Shen Anyu's heart was dead. She didn't even know how she managed to arrange her daughter's funeral. The system in her mind urged her, host, we have detected that the target's favorability is constantly fluctuating. Do you still want to leave this world? Should she leave? Shen Anyu thought that all the reasons she had to stay in this world had been lost. She had once wanted to stay for Lu Chen, but the man she had loved more than her own life had already moved on and had discarded her like a worn-out shoe. She had also wanted to stay for her daughter, but her daughter, her Yaoyao, had already left her forever. Shen Anyu wiped the tears from her swollen red eyes, her voice almost numb. Before I leave, I have one last thing to do. In the afternoon, Shen Anyu went to the Lu's residence. This house, which she had once called her home, now only felt foreign to her. She stood by the door and knocked. After a moment, Lu Chen opened the door. When he saw Shen Anyu, he was shocked, a flicker of pain flashing across his eyes, but his tone was still cold. What are you doing here? Yesterday morning, Yaoyao passed away. Shen Anyu's voice was very soft, like it would be swept away by the wind at any moment. Lu Chen's heart suddenly felt a sharp, stabbing pain. For some reason, he felt as if something extremely important had vanished from his life. After a long pause, he suppressed the discomfort in his heart, and said coldly, she died of an illness. It's her real father's bad genes, she was a sickly child from birth. Shen Anyu's lips trembled slightly. She pulled a lock of hair from her pocket and handed it to him. This is a sample of Yaoyao's hair, you can do another genetic test. I told you, I've already done a test. Lu Chen was interrupted by Shen Anyu. Lu Chen, you're a coward, a spineless coward. Shen Anyu's nails dug deeply into her palms, the ridicule in her eyes, piercing Lu Chen's heart. You suspected that she wasn't your child, yet you didn't even dare to ask me once. Before Yaoyao died, she was still waiting for you to come see her, waiting for you to celebrate her birthday with her, calling out for her mother and father. Shen Anyu released her hand, the strands of hair scattering in the air. Lu Chen, you are a bastard. You killed your own biological daughter. Shen Anyu turned away, staggering away from the house where she had lived for 5 years, her figure looking thin and pitiful. Lu Chen watched her walk away, his heart feeling like it had been crushed by a massive stone, making it hard to breathe. As if compelled by some unseen force, he bent down to pick up a few strands of hair, and sent them, along with his own hair, to the testing agency again. The next morning, the test report was sent to Lu Chen's phone. In an instant, it felt like his heart had fallen into a frozen pond. The line of text in the test result clearly stated, after testing, the paternal sample is the biological father of the tested child sample. Lu Chen's fingertips trembled, the simple line of text in the test report almost made him feel like he was being pierced with 1,000 needles. He felt a dull pain in his chest, his heart churning. In an instant, almost uncontrollably, he dialed Shen Anyu's number. He was desperate to ask her what had happened. However, the phone rang for a long time, but there was no answer. Lu Chen listened to the cold, busy tone, feeling increasingly restless and annoyed. In anger, he slammed his phone onto the table. Yi Qingqing had just come downstairs, and was startled by him, holding her belly as she asked softly, "Aiken, what's wrong?" Lu Chen turned to look at her. His gaze swept over her slightly swollen abdomen. A night of recklessness after being drunk had resulted in Yi Qingqing carrying his child. Lu Chen had a lump in his throat, but forced down his emotions. "It's nothing, I'm going to work." After leaving the house, Lu Chen immediately called his assistant. "Contact the hospital that did the paternity test 3 years ago. Go now." 3 years ago, it was also his assistant who had taken his and Yaoyao's hair for the test. After hanging up the phone, Lu Chen cut to the test results page on his phone again. The test results indicated that he and Yaoyao were biological father and daughter. But this result was completely the opposite of the test he had done 3 years ago. If this test was true, then what had happened with the test report 3 years ago? Lu Chen rubbed the bridge of his nose, forcing himself to suppress the doubts in his heart, and trying to focus on his work. However, his thoughts wouldn't calm down. That night, Lu Chen had a sudden dream. In his dream, Yaoyao was just over 1 year old, and very healthy and lively. When he returned from work, Yaoyao was in the living room, watching Peppa Pig. He was standing by the door, calling softly, "Baby, Daddy's home." Yaoyao turned around and, with her small, chubby legs, rushed into his arms. He picked up his daughter and kissed her small face, took out the small toy he had bought for her on the way home, his eyes full of affection. Suddenly, a strong gust of wind blew, blinding him. When he opened his eyes again, the world had turned a bleak red. Yaoyao was wearing a small hospital gown, lying on a hospital bed, looking at him with eyes filled with longing. "Daddy, why don't you come see me?" As she spoke, 2 tears of blood ran down her cheeks. "Daddy, do you not want Yaoyao anymore?" Lu Chen suddenly woke up from his dream, his heart aching as if a piece of it had been torn out with a knife. His hand trembled as he turned on the bedside lamp. The scene in his dream was so real, so devastating, that he couldn't go back to sleep. He sat on the edge of the bed, touching his face, realizing that he had been crying in his sleep. He took out his phone again, and flipped to the test report. The words at the bottom of the conclusion pierced his eyes deeply. If this test report was true. Lu Chen got out of bed and went to the balcony, looking up at the gray sky, and lit a cigarette. Ever since the moment he had received the first test report more than 2 years ago, he had been convinced that Yaoyao was not his daughter. That she wasn't the crystallization of his love with Shen Anyu, and didn't have his blood running through her veins. On the contrary, it was proof that Shen Anyu had cheated on him and loved another man. Therefore, the more Shen Anyu treated Yaoyao well, the more desperately she tried to save the child, the more resentment grew in his heart. In the end, he betrayed his marriage. But now, a second test report had appeared. The results were completely opposite of the first one. Lu Chen didn't even dare to think about what he would do if the first test report was incorrect and he had given up on his own daughter, how he would face his daughter's death, how he would face his future life. Lu Chen smoked half a pack of cigarettes on the balcony, and when he returned to the living room, the sky was still dim. To his surprise, someone was sitting on the sofa in the living room. "Mom, what happened to you?" he asked, walking over to his mother. "Ah." His usually bold mother seemed to be startled by him, and suddenly leaned back. Lu Chen frowned heavily. "Mom." His mother came back to her senses and lifted her hand to wipe her eyes, not daring to look at her son. She lowered her head, her voice panicked. I dreamed about Yaoyao." There wasn't much pity or longing for her granddaughter in her mother's tone. Instead, it was full of fear. If it was any other time, Lu Chen would have noticed something was off. However, he was also in a daze and didn't hear the strangeness in his mother's tone. The mother and son sat in silence, looking at each other, until daybreak. As the first rays of dawn spilled through, his mother seemed to have recovered. She sighed and said softly, "Perhaps the child's death was too tragic, which is why she's so resentful." The phrase, "too tragic," struck Lu Chen's heart deeply. He remembered how Shen Anyu had said that, before Yaoyao died, she had been constantly calling out for her mother and father. She was so young, yet she had died alone on an operating table. "When it's light, I'll go to Faiyuan Temple in the suburbs, and light a longevity lamp for the child," his mother said to her son, "and I'll get you a safety charm." Lu Chen had never believed in the so-called next life. The so-called longevity lamp was just a way to comfort the living using the names of the dead. So, did Yaoyao's death also make his mother feel uneasy? Lu Chen went to his company in a daze. He had no heart to deal with the large stack of files, his mind in turmoil. At noon, his assistant suddenly knocked on his door. "Mr. Liu, I verified what you asked me to check." Lu Chen immediately snapped to attention. He looked at his assistant, his gaze betraying an unconscious tension. The assistant swallowed and looked at Lu Chen anxiously. "There are no problems with the test results from 3 years ago." In that moment, Lu Chen suddenly felt a sense of relief. Compared to the thought that Yaoyao wasn't his biological daughter, he was now more afraid of facing the fact that he had gotten the test results wrong and abandoned his daughter. "I see, you can leave," Lu Chen said, waving his hand. The assistant walked towards the door, but suddenly stopped as he reached the entrance. "Is there something else?" Lu Chen asked, lifting his head and glancing at him with displeasure. "Mr. Liu, there's something that I feel I must tell you." The assistant stood at the door, his young face full of conflict. Lu Chen's whole heart was racing. For some reason, he felt that whatever the assistant was about to say, it would be too much for him to bear. "On the day of the test, your mother suddenly came to the hospital," the assistant said, lowering his head. "She had said that she wanted to wait for the results with me. But when I went to pour water, I saw her seemingly touch the box where I had put the samples. She said that she accidentally knocked it over and picked up the box for me," the assistant said hesitantly. "At that time, I didn't think much about it. How could anyone think that a mother would switch her own son's paternity test sample?" In that instant, Lu Chen felt like the world had turned black. The very foundation of the world seemed to become blurry and distorted into a mass of black impurities. Many details that he had consciously ignored began to surface in his mind. His mother had always disliked Yaoyao. 3 months after Yaoyao was born, she had told Shen Anyu to take care of her body and then quickly have another son. When Yaoyao was diagnosed with leukemia, both he and Shen Anyu were distraught. But his mother had immediately sought him out and told him to give up Yaoyao's treatment, telling him not to waste so much money on a daughter. Everything showed his mother's dissatisfaction with Yaoyao. But he had never expected his mother to switch his test samples. No, this is impossible. Luchin stood up. His assistant had worked with him for several years, and the last time he saw him this upset was when he received the test results. Luchin didn't have time to care about the people around him. He had to go to Faiyuan Temple. He had to ask his mother if it was really her who had done it. In the cold winter, fewer people were going to temples to burn incense. The plum blossoms at the entrance of the temple bloomed stubbornly in the ice and snow. Luchin drove his car all the way, the wheels kicking up the half-melted snow. After a short while, he arrived at Faiyuan Temple in the suburbs. The temple was a place of peace. Luchin didn't make a commotion. His eyes were red as he searched for his mother. He walked up the steps, becoming increasingly rushed, completely losing his usual composure. He passed the Baohua Hall. The gods and Buddhas in the hall seemed to be looking down at him from on high, as if they had seen through his nervousness and cowardice. Luchin moved as if he was under a spell, not stopping. Finally, near a meditation room, he heard his mother's voice. His mother was inside the meditation room, talking to a senior monk, her voice full of tears. "I never thought that things would turn out this way." Luchin suddenly stopped in his tracks. Standing outside the meditation room, he felt like his heart was being crushed slowly. At the time, I just didn't want him to waste too much time or too much money on a sickly child. I didn't want that mother and daughter to drag my son down. Ever since I learned that Yaoyao had died, I've been having nightmares every night. I dream that Yaoyao is reaching out to me, calling me grandma. Luchin felt like he had been struck by lightning. He held his chest, not being able to breathe from the pain. When he and Shen Anyu had first gotten married, his company had only just started up. Although he had made some money from his business, his cash flow was very tight, and he didn't have a lot of money on hand. After learning that Yaoyao had leukemia, his first thought was to sell his house to pay for his daughter's treatment. However, his mother had stopped him and was constantly telling him that Yaoyao wasn't his daughter, and that there was no history of leukemia in the Liu family. He didn't know how to explain it to his mother, and he was afraid that his mother would argue with Anyu and Yaoyao. In the end, he had pulled out some of his hair and Yaoyao's hair, and asked his assistant to get it tested. Before that, he had never suspected that Shen Anyu would betray him. Therefore, he didn't even go for the test himself, he just sent his assistant. However, the test results had almost made him feel like the sky had collapsed. Looking back at what had happened, Luchin hated himself at the time. Just as Shen Anyu had said, he was a spineless coward. Why hadn't he dared to ask Shen Anyu directly back then? Or, why hadn't he changed testing agencies and checked again? He walked out in a daze, his heart like it had been cut to pieces. The monks in the temple were chanting scriptures, but those scriptures, which were meant to soothe the soul, couldn't calm his heart, even for a moment. The winter wind and snow grew heavier, and Luchin felt like he had been pulled out of a pool of ice. Standing by the entrance of the temple, he gripped his phone, and dialed Shen Anyu's number again. He had no idea how to face Shen Anyu. But at that moment, he just wanted to find her. Their daughter was dead, she must have been filled with unbearable grief. Only she could empathize with his pain. The phone rang once, then twice, but no one answered until he was sent to voicemail. He remembered how he had refused to answer her calls back then. At the time, she had been carrying her sick daughter. How despairing must she have felt? Crematorium. Shen Anyu took her daughter's body to the crematorium. The pain of separation is one of the greatest pains in life. Having family members to accompany you made that pain seem like something to be shared. Therefore, when taking a loved one to the crematorium, people never went alone, the family members would always be there. But Shen Anyu was all alone as she sent Yaoyao off. She didn't belong to this world in the first place. All alone, she had only two relatives. One was her husband, Lu Chen, who had already cut all ties with her. And the other was her daughter, Yaoyao, the one she was sending off today. Shen Anyu's tears had already dried up. She was dressed in a disheveled, black and gray outfit, leaning on the iron railing, seeing her daughter off on her final journey. A big fire, along with Shen Anyu's dried-up tears, turned a living person into a small pile of ashes. Shen Anyu held her daughter's ashes in her arms and personally bought 2 grave plots. One, to bury her daughter. And the other, to bury herself when her time came. Lu Chen didn't go home. He didn't know how to face that so-called home. So, just like the night he first received the test results, he went to a bar and got drunk alone. The burning alcohol flowed down his throat, numbing the memories and the pain. After getting drunk, Lu Chen stumbled back home, his steps unsteady. The cold winter wind blew on him, making him shiver. He threw up in a flower bed on the side of the road. After a while, he leaned against the steps beside the flower bed, his mind fuzzy, thinking that he was already dead. When he woke up again, it was from the cold. A slightly unfamiliar voice drifted from a distance, a young man's voice laced with emotion as he spoke. "Please believe me, I will try my best, I will give you and the child a better life." Lu Chen shook his head, it was like seeing his past self. Back then, he had worked so hard, with that same hope in his heart. He wanted to give Anyu and Yaoyao the best life possible. But he had destroyed all of that with his own hands. He staggered to his feet, and, in his heart, cheered the young man on. Then, he heard the next sentence. "Ching, you can't do this. How can you take my child and marry someone else?" Lu Chen's brow twitched. He looked in the direction of the voice. Under the streetlights, Yi Qingqing was struggling with a young man, their long shadows stretched out beside them. Yi Qingqing was pushing the man away, her voice choked with emotion but determined. "He Yong, don't say anything more. I absolutely will not marry you. And my child cannot have a manual laborer as a father. Qingqing. Please trust me. Give me some time." The man's desperate cries traveled far in the light rain. But Yi Qingqing slapped his hand away. She pointed to the necklace around her neck. "Do you know how much this necklace cost? 500,000. He bought it for me. He can give me a life that you could never hope to achieve, even if you worked for 30 more years. Don't come here again." Yi Qingqing's voice was also full of emotion. "I'm not going to have this child. After I marry him, I will have an abortion. I can't be like his ex-wife and give him a child that doesn't belong to him." In an instant, lightning flashed. The lightning cut through the sky, revealing the desperate man hiding in the shadows. Yi Qingqing was pale with fear, staring blankly at the corner of the wall. "Aiken?" Lu Chen walked towards her, step by step. His eyes were terrifying, like those of a wild beast about to go mad. Yi Qingqing's manual laborer boyfriend subconsciously stepped in front of Yi Qingqing, trying to shield her. Lu Chen didn't do anything. In the weak night light, he lowered his head and looked at the necklace around Yi Qingqing's neck. It was a dazzling diamond necklace, the same one that Yi Qingqing had seen through a shop window, and had not been able to take her eyes off of. That day, he had already prepared the 500,000. But for some reason, he just didn't want to let Shen Anyu break up with him so easily. So, when Yi Qingqing had pouted, he had agreed. He hadn't thought that that necklace could be worth his daughter's life. If, back then, he had had more trust in Shen Anyu, would life have been this bad? But who could he blame? He could only blame himself. He was the one who was so stupid, he was the one who made this decision. Lu Chen took one last look at Yi Qingqing, and then at He Yong, who was protecting her. He should be angry, he should be furious. After all, Yi Qingqing was about to marry him, yet she was cheating on him. But now, he wasn't as angry as he should have been. Instead, he just felt relief. "I'll have the housekeeper pack your things and send them to you, and don't ever appear in front of me again." "Aiken." don't do this. This was just an accident. Yi Qingqing started crying immediately. I just wanted to say goodbye to him, she said, heartbroken. I will have an abortion. I was originally planning to abort the child after we got married. Lu Chen shook his head. If it hadn't been for this child, he wouldn't have married Yi Qingqing anyway. The so-called marital infidelity, in fact, was just revenge against Shen Anyu. He walked past Yi Qingqing and headed home with heavy steps. When he entered the house, his mother rushed over to greet him with a flurry of cries. He stood at the door, looking around at the familiar yet strange house. This was his and Shen Anyu's marital home. Every table and chair was hand-picked by her, and many of the small details showed how much she had loved and cared for this home. But now, this place that was so familiar was filled with things that felt so foreign to him. Home, suddenly, didn't feel like home anymore. Shen Anyu dealt with her daughter's funeral arrangements on her own. After everything was done, she finally started to think about leaving the world, like the system had mentioned. Now, in this world, she had nothing left to hold her back. It was time for her to leave. The system had told her that once she left this world, her body would turn into a real corpse. Shen Anyu didn't want her death to affect anyone else. After careful consideration, she decided that, if she died in the rental apartment, the landlord would find it unlucky. And if she died in a hotel, it would affect the hotel's business. After much deliberation, she decided to jump into the river. The Wind and Rain Bridge on New Year's Eve. Shen Anyu ate her last meal in this world alone, changed into a nice set of clothes, and arrived at the Wind and Rain Bridge. The first time she had appeared in this world had also been by the Wind and Rain Bridge. Because she had been suddenly dropped into this world, she had lost her footing and fallen into the icy Wind and Rain River. That had been 8 years ago, in the spring. Lu Chen, who had recently graduated, had been jogging on both banks of the Wind and Rain River. Seeing someone fall into the water, he had quickly jumped in to save her. Shen Anyu didn't know how to swim, and when she fell into the river, she thought that her life would end there. Her chest was getting tighter and tighter, her vision darker and darker. When she no longer had the strength to struggle, and she was about to sink to the bottom of the river, a powerful force had suddenly pulled her up. The young man had reached out and pulled her back from the edge of death. At the same time, the system had erupted in fireworks in her mind. System, congratulations host, you have triggered the capture character, and have activated the capture plot. From then on, the capture mission set by the system had begun, and so had her ill-fated relationship with Lu Chen. She had rented a house near Lu Chen's house, and then went to the same company as him for an interview. She had used the points she had earned from completing the missions to redeem enough of this world's currency, supporting him as he started his company. She had carefully observed his preferences, transforming herself into the person he liked. At first, she thought she was just doing it to complete the missions. However, when the capture completion rate reached 100%, he had knelt down in front of her, and opened the beautiful ring box. He looked at her so passionately. Anyu, are you willing to spend the rest of your life with me? Looking into his sincere eyes, she finally realized that the mission was also her own desire. She had fallen in love with this man at first sight. Shen Anyu had cried as she told him, I do. And so, she had stayed in this world for him. The system in her mind had fallen silent. She had thought that this would be the beginning of a wonderful life. But then, her daughter had fallen gravely ill. And her husband had cheated on her after their daughter had gotten sick. Life had delivered blow after blow, capsizing her small boat of a life. And it was Yaoyao's death that finally made her lose the courage to stay. The scenes from the past flashed through Shen Anyu's mind, like a slideshow. In the distance, she could hear people counting down for the new year. Brilliant fireworks, with long tails, rose to their highest point, erupting in a magnificent, fleeting beauty. Shen Anyu closed her eyes and jumped gently. The cold water touched her clothes and her skin, like an invisible hand, dragging her down. Just at that moment, she suddenly heard the system's voice in her mind. Congratulations host, the mission has been completed, capture character's favorability has risen to 100%. You can now live a free life in this world. Shen Anyu called out to the system in her mind, what do you mean, a free life? However, the system released a huge fireworks show in her mind, as if it was the end of a segment of life. Then, no matter how much she called out, there was no response. In terror, Shen Anyu choked on 2 mouthfuls of water. As oxygen kept flowing away, Shen Anyu thought, how ridiculous. When she had wanted to live, it had made her suffer. And now that she had decided to be reborn, the system had abandoned her. She had fallen into the river, and if she didn't want to die, she would die. Shen Anyu closed her eyes, preparing to accept her fate. However, at that moment, a powerful force grabbed her wrist. The young man reached out and pulled her back from the brink of death. She was placed on the shore, wet all over. The wind was biting, and she was so cold that each breath was painful. Shen Anyu barely managed to open her eyes, and saw Jiang Yiheng in front of her. His face was pale white, even more shocking than hers. On New Year's Eve, places like the Wind and Rain Bridge always had police and medical vehicles nearby. Someone had discovered that someone had jumped into the river at the Wind and Rain Bridge, and the medical team had arrived quickly. Before long, the 2 of them had been sent to the hospital. Shen Anyu had changed out of her wet clothes into dry hospital gowns, and had quickly warmed up in the hospital's air-conditioned room. However, Jiang Yiheng, who had saved her, started running a high fever when they got to the hospital. After arriving at the hospital, the city quickly arranged for him to be examined and put on an 4 drip. Shen Anyu had stayed by his side. Over the years, she had accompanied Yaoyao to so many hospitals that she had lost track of how many times she had been to hospitals. She knew every room in the city's big hospitals like the back of her hand. By the time the sun was starting to rise, Jiang Yiheng had finished his 4 drip, and the fever on his forehead had finally subsided, so he finally opened his eyes. Shen Anyu helped him put a pillow behind his back, and asked him softly, are you hungry? Do you want to eat breakfast? Thank you, Jiang Yiheng said, shaking his head, I'm not hungry. I'm the one who should be thanking you, you saved me. Shen Anyu curled her lips and smiled, a smile that was worse than a cry, and I also caused you to have a fever, and have an 4 drip in the middle of the night. It's just that my health isn't good, Jiang Yiheng said, propping himself up, although I've made it through the adaptation period, my body is still not good, and even small things can cause me to get fevers and colds. The doctor said that what you did was very dangerous, Shen Anyu said softly, don't do that again in the future. Jiang Yiheng was silent for a long time. He didn't ask Shen Anyu why she had jumped into the river, and Shen Anyu didn't take the initiative to bring it up. This was probably a form of tacit understanding between adults. On the first day of the Lunar New Year, the 2 of them stayed in the hospital all day. By the evening, the doctor finally allowed Jiang Yiheng to be discharged. Outside the hospital, Jiang Yiheng suddenly asked, do you want to leave here with me? Huh? Shen Anyu looked at him in surprise. Leave this place that makes you sad, and go to another city and start over. The sun was shining faintly on his face. For some unknown reason, Shen Anyu thought of Lu Chen. Many years ago, Lu Chen had held her in his arms during a rainy night, his warm breath brushing against her ear, and he had whispered to her, for me, can you stay? Now, everything that had made her stay was gone. Lu Chen's New Year's Eve had been just as messy and broken. He couldn't stand to stay at home. The familiarity that was everywhere in the house was causing his heart to ache. So, late at night, he went to the cemetery. When Lu Chen arrived at the cemetery, it was dark all around. He had no fear in his heart, and walked towards the tombstones, against the increasingly strong wind. The moment he saw the tombstone, a sharp pain went through his heart. He rushed towards the tombstone, squatted down, and saw the photo on it. It was Yaoyao's first birthday photo. At that time, she had been so healthy, her smile so bright and radiant. Lu Chen could still remember when he had gone with his daughter to get her first birthday photos taken. His daughter had been so well behaved and had cooperated so well. After the photos had been developed, Shen Anyu had been reluctant to delete any of them, so she had added a lot of money to get a thick photo album. Just thinking about that made Lucien feel like he was having difficulty breathing. He touched the picture on the tombstone and said softly, "Yaoyao, Daddy has come to see you." At that moment, a strong wind blew, messing up his hair. The cold wind rushed into his eyes, making them bloodshot. A tear fell in front of the tombstone, carrying with it his full regret. Scenes from the past flashed through his mind like a slideshow. Countless times, Yaoyao had reached out her arms, wanting his hugs, wanting him to lift her up. But he had immersed himself in his sadness and anger. He hadn't done his duty as a father, and he had abandoned his daughter's life, even when she was critically ill. After paying his respects to his daughter, Lucien left the cemetery all alone. At that time, the brilliant fireworks in the distance rose into the sky, marking the arrival of the new year. Lucien almost couldn't stop himself from leaning against the hood of his car and dialing Shen Anyu's number. This time, he was once again greeted with a cold, electronic female voice. "The number you have dialed is currently unavailable." Lucien sat in the car, smoking all night. When the sun rose, he returned to the cold house. When he went inside, he saw his mother sitting on the sofa. "Where did you go for the new year? Why didn't you come home?" He waved his hand wearily, not wanting to say anything. But his mother wasn't about to let him go. She chased after him, like a shadow. "What happened with Yi Qingqing? She said you were going to break up with her." "Aiken. She is pregnant with your child, how can you?" When he heard the word child, Lucien could no longer suppress the anger in his heart. "The child in her belly isn't mine, my daughter. My Yaoyao was killed by you." His eyes were bloodshot as he looked at his aging mother, a sense of indescribable sorrow welling up inside him. All this time, he had always trusted his mother so much, he had never thought that she would do anything to hurt him. However, it was also this woman who had nagged him to do a paternity test, and had even switched his testing sample. He had ended up where he was today, and at least half of it could be blamed on his own mother. His mother's lips trembled slightly, and a moment later, cloudy tears started to fall. "I just didn't want them to drag you down." She grabbed her son's sleeve, like a drowning person clinging on to a last piece of driftwood. "At that time, you were starting your company. You were going through so much. Shen Anyu wanted to quit her job to take care of the child, and Yaoyao had that kind of disease. I was afraid that they would be the downfall of you. I did all of this for you. My son." She sounded like she had reached the peak of grief. "As long as you have a successful career, you can always marry another wife and have more children, so what would that matter?" Lucien pried his mother's fingers off him one by one. "Just because she had a disease, did that make her not my daughter?" A tear fell from the corner of his eyes. "Then, if I had gotten sick when I was a kid, would you have thrown me away too?" His mother couldn't speak. In an instant, she was filled with regret. There had been cases of people getting cured of leukemia. And even if the child had died, if she had been properly treated, then Shen Anyu wouldn't have been able to say anything, and they could have just had another child. Why had she made everything so bad? Causing her son to be separated from his wife and daughter, breaking up their family. Most importantly, making him break up with her. His mother lowered her head, no longer daring to look directly at her son's eyes. "Mom, you should go home," Lucien said, his voice very soft. His mother looked at him blankly, as if she couldn't believe that the son who had always been so filial would drive her away. Lucien's voice was firm. "From now on, I will continue to send you your living expenses every month. But, don't come here again." "Lucien, I am your own mother. How can you treat me like this?" Lucien went upstairs silently and returned to his master bedroom. He slept with all his clothes on, and when he woke up again, he felt hot all over, his temperature unnaturally high. It was just a common cold, so he pulled open the drawer in his bedside table to take some cold medicine. However, when he pulled open the drawer, he saw the family photo that he had put away earlier. It was from when Yaoyao was 1 year old. He and Shen Anyu had gone with her to get them taken, and it was the same set of photos as the one on Yaoyao's tombstone. Shen Anyu was holding Yaoyao, and he was holding his wife and daughter. Their hands were clasped together, and their wedding rings were shining brightly. He wiped the photo frame clean, put it back into the bedside table, and touched his own empty ring finger. There had been a ring there. But then, after he thought that Shen Anyu had cheated on him, he had thrown it into a sewer. Luchan leaned back on the bed. He suddenly felt regret. He even hated that he couldn't go to that sewer now and try to find that ring. He rushed downstairs. When he turned his head, he saw a large pile of things on the balcony. Those were the things that he had told Shen Anyu to move out when he had ordered her to leave, and that his mother had packed up for her to take. Luchan stood on the balcony and, step by step, he brought the messy bags of belongings back inside. It had been a long time since he had personally done such household chores, but he strangely found comfort in doing them. By bringing the house back to its familiar form, it almost felt like he could bring life back to the way it was before. Suddenly, he found a piece of thin fabric in one of the bags containing clothes. His heart suddenly felt hot. It was the sexy negligee that she had been wearing that night. Luchan held the cool fabric in his hand, and suddenly felt intense regret. He knew that Shen Anyu had always wanted another child to use the umbilical cord blood to save Yaoyao. He couldn't help but wonder, if he had agreed back then, perhaps Yaoyao would have been saved, and he and Shen Anyu would have had a new bond. Luchan spent an entire day, bringing the house back to its former state. As it got closer to evening, he almost couldn't control himself and thought of Shen Anyu. He wanted to find her. What was she doing now? Meanwhile, Jiang Yihong was in Shen Anyu's rented apartment, watching her pack her things. Shen Anyu hadn't moved her luggage from the Lu family house. That day, when she had been chased out by his mother, she hadn't taken anything, except for her phone and ID card. Now, the rental apartment only contained a few sets of clothes that she had brought with her when she was staying at the hospital. With such few belongings, she could fit everything into a small handbag. Shen Anyu thought that it was for the best. Since she had decided to let go of the past, there was no need to bring anything from it with her. Looking at them would only make her feel sad. After packing everything, Jiang Yihong reached out to help her carry the bag. Shen Anyu turned slightly to the side. "You don't have to trouble yourself, I don't have that much stuff, I can carry it myself." Jiang Yihong knew how stubborn she was and didn't insist. And so, the two of them, only carrying a few belongings, went to Fengqing, near Jiang City. Jiang City was the capital of a province, prosperous and busy. Fengqing, however, was different. This city, 200 kilometers from the provincial capital, was a tourist city famous for its ancient towns. Shen Anyu followed Jiang Yihong, walking on the cobblestone streets, and reached a quaint stilted building. Looking at the slightly deserted guest house, Shen Anyu asked, "Did you book this guest house?" Jiang Yihong smiled and led her through the door. The young girl who was working the front desk, wearing a traditional Miao ethnic costume, was leaning against her hand, her tone lazy as she said, "We serve drinks on the first floor and rooms on the second." Jiang Yihong went over and knocked on the counter. "Don't you recognize your boss anymore?" The girl turned her head and saw Jiang Yihong, looking shocked. "Boss, why did you come here?" "2 rooms, don't talk so much." After a moment, Shen Anyu, carrying her handbag, walked up the newly refurbished wooden stairs, towards the guest rooms on the second floor. She put down her things, and opened the window. Below, as far as her eyes could see, was the Tuo River. It was too cold in Fengqing during the winter, so it wasn't the best time for sightseeing. However, it was still the Lunar New Year, and there were still some couples from the province coming to travel, so it wasn't completely deserted. Shen Anyu leaned against the window, watching the brilliant winter sun, as it shone on the glittering surface of the river, like a golden wave flowing forward. She thought of Yaoyao. Before, when Yaoyao had seen the Tuo River on TV, she had said that she wanted to go there. She had promised her daughter that when she was a little older, she would bring her there on holiday. Yaoyao had told her very seriously, "We have to bring Daddy along too." However, her Yaoyao had not been able to grow up. Her father had also completely ignored her words. Shen Anyu was in a daze as she looked into the distance. She suddenly heard a knock on her door. "Shen Anyu, are you going out to eat dinner?" She quickly wiped her eyes and opened the door. Jiang Yihong was waiting for her at the door. A moment later, the two of them were walking one after the other on the cobbled roads of the ancient town. The cold winter wind blew on Shen Anyu, making her shiver. A coat, with its body heat still lingering, was draped over her shoulders, shielding her from the wind. Fengqing is a bit colder than Jiang City, right? Fengqing was surrounded by mountains and water. Compared to the bustling metropolis that had a heat island effect, its temperature was at least 5 degrees lower. The clothes that were enough in Jiang City wouldn't be enough in Fengqing. Shen Anyu looked at him. Jiang Yihong rubbed his nose, not daring to look her in the eye. "You should keep the coat. What if you catch a cold? That will be a problem." Shen Anyu smiled and handed him back the coat. Jiang Yihong stiffened. His eyes met hers. Seeing that her gaze was firm, he had no choice but to take his coat back with a bitter laugh. He ridiculed himself, "Someone with my health, I really can't take care of you." From his tone, Shen Anyu could hear a hint of melancholy. She had gotten used to taking care of patients, so she could naturally understand his feelings. After thinking for a bit, she led him into a small shop by the side of the road, and picked out a thick scarf. "It's your turn to pay for it." She flipped the tag on the scarf and showed it to Jiang Yihong. Soon, her phone buzzed, WeChat Pay of 236 yuan. After leaving the shop, Jiang Yihong helped her put on the scarf. The two of them walked forward, one after the other, not speaking. The sun began to set, and dusk settled in. Beside them, a young couple were holding hands as they slowly walked along the lovers' bridge. The girl called out to her boyfriend cheerfully, "Come here, this is a great angle, take a picture of me." Shen Anyu stood in place, giving the couple some space to take their picture. Jiang Yihong stood beside her and asked her softly, "Are you hungry? Let's go eat something?" Shen Anyu nodded. There was another unsettling silence. After a moment, Shen Anyu spoke up first, "Jiang Yihong, thank you for being so good to me." Jiang Yihong turned his head, "It's nothing, I'm just taking you away to clear your mind. I hope you can be happy." Jiang Yihong, "I can't be happy right now. I can't think about anything else either, can you understand?" Shen Anyu lowered her eyes, looking at the cobblestone path, her tone flat. She felt like she was an empty person who had lost all her strength. Apart from the grief that filled her heart, she didn't have much emotion. They were both adults, and she could naturally feel how good Jiang Yihong was to her. However, she didn't have the mind to accept it, or the strength to reciprocate. There was a moment of silence in the air. After a long time, Jiang Yihong's gentle voice drifted from beside her, "I understand, I'm only taking you away to clear your mind." For the next 2 weeks or so, Shen Anyu stayed at the nameless guest house. She would sleep until late in the morning, and, wearing thick clothes, she would wander around the guesthouse area. Jiang Yihong was not very free. This guesthouse had originally been his own dream. "Back then, I was thinking that once I got cured, I would come to Fengqing and open a guesthouse, and live a carefree life." The young girl at the front desk was wiping the table as she said, "Running a guesthouse is anything but carefree." Jiang Yihong laughed bitterly, "Yeah, you can't live a carefree life anywhere. Running a guesthouse might seem relaxed, but only people who didn't care about business could do that. It wasn't easy to actually run a business and make a profit." Shen Anyu glanced at him and opened her mouth slightly. When she was in college, she had said what she hoped her life would be like during a truth or dare game. She had wanted to find a scenic town, open a guest house, and become a charming landlady. Find a man who was full of artistic style, have a cute daughter, and live a life like that in Tongfu guest house. However, she had gotten together with Lu Chen. For that man, she had given up everything she had wanted. She had stayed in Jiang City, become his wife, and had lived a life that she had never wanted. Shen Anyu glanced at Jiang Yihong, but she didn't voice any of her questions. Maybe she had just thought too much. How could he still remember a joke she had made so many years ago? But, what if he did remember? The thought flashed through her mind. She raised her eyes again and looked at Jiang Yihong. He had suddenly fallen to the ground, vomiting large amounts of blood. Shen Anyu was stunned, her mind going blank. She reached out a trembling hand to hold him, as she called out in panic, "Call them, call an ambulance. Fengqing People's Hospital." Jiang Yihong, his face pale, was wheeled into the operating room. The operating room light stayed on all night. Shen Anyu sat outside the emergency room. In a daze, it was as if she had returned to that night. From the corner of the hallway, she could hear the sound of hurried footsteps. A pair of wealthy-looking, but weary-looking, elderly couple, quickly walked over. Shen Anyu looked at them with some confusion. "You're Shen Anyu, right?" The old woman, her voice a bit aged, stated her name. Shen Anyu was confused. "Who are you?" "I'm Yihong's mother." Mrs. Jiang looked at her, and suddenly grabbed her hand, crying. "He said he wanted to come see you. Thank you for being with him these past few days." For the next few minutes, Shen Anyu felt like her thoughts had been completely drained. It was then that she learned that Jiang Yihong had gone abroad for surgery. However, he had suffered a severe rejection reaction after the operation. His days were numbered, which was why he was so physically frail. Doctors had advised him to undergo conservative treatment abroad to prolong his life as much as possible. But he refused to stay in the hospital any longer. The surgery had lasted a full 8 hours. When Jiang Yihong was finally wheeled out, his life had been saved, but he was immediately transferred to the ICU. After 3 days of observation, he was moved to a private room. Only then was Shen Anyu granted the opportunity to visit him. Before that, while he was in the ICU, Zhang's parents had taken turns going in. She couldn't bear to, nor did she want to compete with the two elderly people for those precious moments to see their son. Jiang Yihong's face was frighteningly pale, and an 4 drip was connected to the back of his hand around the clock. Seeing her enter, he gave a weak smile. "Scared you, didn't I?" Shen Anyu's lips trembled. "Why are you so foolish? Why didn't you stay abroad for further treatment? If there were a cure, of course, I would have taken it." He sighed. "But there isn't, is there?" Shen Anyu immediately lowered her head, afraid he would see her tears. "Don't cry." He tugged at his pale lips. "If Yaoyao knew that I had made her mother cry, she might get mad at me when she sees me in the afterlife." "Don't talk nonsense." Shen Anyu quickly wiped her eyes, though her eye sockets were still red. "You need to rest for a few more days, and then go abroad." She was trying to reassure Jiang Yihong, but also herself. Medical science is advancing rapidly. If you undergo conservative treatment, you might be able to buy more time, and who knows, maybe a cure will be found. Jiang Yihong shook his head, but he didn't argue with her. A week later, his parents arranged a private jet to transfer him to the United States. Some surgeries were not feasible in China for various reasons, but abroad, anything was possible with enough money. For their only son, Zhang's parents were willing to give up everything. Before leaving, Jiang Yihong bid farewell to Shen Anyu. "Your life, I risked mine to save it. Promise me, no matter what happens in the future, don't ever give up on life, okay?" Shen Anyu nodded emphatically. Jiang Yihong touched her face. "You have no idea how much I wish I had a healthy body. If only I didn't have to go to the United States for treatment, if only I didn't have to face the threat of death every day. If only I had a healthy body, I could have stayed in China. Maybe then you wouldn't have been hurt so deeply today? You wouldn't have had to go through so much torment?" Shen Anyu understood his unspoken words. But there are no what-ifs in life. In early February, Jiang Yihong left Fengqing. For many years after that, she never saw him again. Before leaving, he left the guest house to her. I also imagine spending my life with you, but my body just can't support it. He stroked Shen Anyu's head and placed a kiss on her forehead. Anyu, you need to make this dream come true for both of us. Take good care of yourself. After Jiang Yihang left, Shen Anyu cried. Only then, when the dusty memories were once again stirred up, did she realize where she had gone wrong. While she had been chasing after Lu Chen, there was someone whose gaze had always been on her. Love is a hand that wants to reach out but doesn't dare. Because the person who wanted to reach out did not have the ability to promise her a lifetime. She calculated the time, and when Jiang Yihang's plane had landed, she sent him a message to ask, "Did you land?" Jiang Yihang replied to her a day and a night later, "Landed a long time ago, then I fell asleep." She didn't press Jiang Yihang on what he meant by fell asleep. In the days that followed, she picked herself up and started managing the guest house he had left her. Occasionally, she would share photos with him, telling him about the changes she had made. Jiang Yihang's reply times were very erratic. However, every time he saw a change she made, he would praise her without reservation. Shen Anyu lived a peaceful life. Jiang Yihang's departure was like a wake-up call from a nightmare. She had always felt that Lu Chen's affair and Yaoyao's passing had robbed her of the courage to live. She was like a snail retreating into its shell, wanting only to find a place to live out the rest of her life in a careless manner. But Jiang Yihang had shattered her illusions. It was only after seeing Jiang Yihang spitting blood in front of her, and after seeing him being tormented by illness and then leave, that she realized she was not actually burdened by a heavy shell. She had always been free. She had a life that was still relatively young, and she had a healthy body. She could not easily waste her life, but needed to live it vibrantly and fully. She shared her thoughts with Jiang Yihang, and he applauded her from the other side of the ocean. You should have thought of this sooner. Even if you want to see Yaoyao, you need to have seen enough of the world before you go to see her. She's still so small, you have to tell her stories for a very long time before she grows up. Life passed by peacefully. Occasionally, Shen Anyu would feel like half a year had gone by. But in reality, it had only been a month since she left Jiangqing. One early spring morning, when the sky was still slightly cool, Shen Anyu was startled awake by a dream. She pushed open the second-floor window and looked out at the river not far away. Some local residents, barefoot and carrying bamboo baskets, boarded boats at the North Gate dock, going down along the stilt houses, their bodies half hidden in the misty water. Shen Anyu felt a sudden sense of unease, so she simply got out of bed. She shivered at the morning chill, her mind instantly clearing, and she quickly closed the window. After getting dressed, she went downstairs for breakfast and then took over from the girl who had worked the night shift. Sitting at the front desk, she worked on the guesthouse's business plan on her computer, occasionally replying to booking messages from social media. After some time, she touched her rumbling stomach and prepared to make herself a bowl of noodles. As soon as she stood up, her vision blurred. A familiar hand, with a familiar grip, tightly grabbed hers and pulled her forward. Shen Anyu's heart skipped a beat, and she looked up into the man's eyes. Lu Chen softly called her name, Anyu. Seeing Lu Chen again gave Shen Anyu a sense of being in a completely different time. She felt like half a year had gone by, but in reality, it had only been a month since she left Jiangqing. Shen Anyu took a step back, freeing her hand from his grip, and softly said, "What are you doing here?" Lu Chen stared at her intently, his eyes filled with deep, unshakable emotion. Some people are like this: when you are together, you don't find them special. But once you are separated, it's like taking a fish out of water. Every single moment is filled with overwhelming longing for him. Anyu, I've been looking for you for a long time. His voice had an almost imperceptible hoarseness. I've been looking for you since the New Year's Eve. Shen Anyu turned and sat back down at the front desk, forcing a stiff smile. Mr. Liu, we have no relationship now, you don't need to look for me. How can we have no relationship? Lu Chen stepped forward, interrupting her. Although we signed the divorce agreement, we haven't obtained a divorce certificate. In the eyes of the law, we are still husband and wife. As Lu Chen spoke, Shen Anyu frowned involuntarily. Thank you for reminding me, so are we going to complete the divorce procedures now? Lu Chen quickly explained, how could that be? I know I was wrong. His bright, charming eyes looked at her sincerely. Anyu, I was wrong about everything in the past. You can punish me any way you like. Seeing that, Shen Anyu looked away, refusing to look at him. Lu Chen lowered his head and squatted in front of her, looking up at her, a touch of pathetic vulnerability in his eyes. Shen Anyu lowered her head, scrutinizing the man before her. He was dressed impeccably, wearing a slightly loose-fitting shirt and a Rolex watch worth hundreds of thousands on his wrist. But he no longer had the arrogance of his previous confidence. Instead, he exuded a sense of anxiety and sadness, with dark circles under his eyes and an air of fatigue that lingered. For some reason, Shen Anyu remembered a long time ago, when she was still pursuing Lu Chen. Lu Chen was a rebellious character, a natural businessman, skilled in taking things to the extreme. He was always like this. Taking advantage of her love for him, making her angry, and then nonchalantly coming back to coax her. The way he looked at her was like he was evaluating a stray dog that no one wanted. He was confident that as long as he beckoned, she would wag her tail and come running. Because at that time, she loved him, and because of the system task, she indulged him without limit. So, no matter what he did, she would only be angry, or pretend to be angry. As long as he said a few soft, sweet words, or at most sent her some jewelry as a token that he had been punished, she would always forgive him. Thus, each time she gave in, he felt like she had no limit to how much she would tolerate. An affair, getting another woman pregnant, causing their daughter's death. Such serious matters, in his eyes, seemed like they could be resolved with a simple "I'm sorry." For a moment, Shen Anyu even found it laughable. Punish? She looked down at Lu Chen. Then I'll punish you by making you be buried with Yaoyao, is that okay? Lu Chen's body stiffened. She grabbed his collar, her eyes revealing a deep-seated hatred. Lu Chen, how can you have the face to ask for my forgiveness? She spoke each word clearly. Back then, I knelt down and begged you to save Yaoyao. I told you, she was your biological daughter, blood was thicker than water. What did you say to me? Shen Anyu sneered. You called her a bastard child and said I cheated on you and wanted a divorce. That was a misunderstanding. Lu Chen's lips trembled, his eyes turning red. The death of his daughter caused him an extreme level of remorse. A misunderstanding? Then was it also a misunderstanding that you took the 500,000 yuan I needed to save her life and bought a necklace for you, Qingqing? Under Shen Anyu's gaze, Lu Chen hung his head, speechless. Apart from obtaining the divorce certificate, I have nothing more to say to you, Shen Anyu said coldly. Yaoyao's death had severed the last bit of attachment that Shen Anyu felt for Lu Chen. In fact, most couples who had truly loved each other were like this. As long as the child was still alive, it was very difficult to truly break off all ties. If Yaoyao had not died, or if they had had other children, then even if Lu Chen had cheated, for the sake of the children, and in light of his sincere apologies, it would have been possible for the couple to get back together. But Yaoyao had died. This event not only caused Shen Anyu extreme grief, but also tortured Lu Chen's conscience day and night. Anyu, it really was a misunderstanding. Lu Chen's eyes turned red. Over the years, as his net worth increased, he had become more reserved and aloof, rarely showing his emotions to others. But now, he was squatting on the ground, his hands covering his face, his appearance completely without any grace. If I had known that she was my biological daughter, would I have been so heartless? Lu Chen's eyes were bloodshot, no trace of his previous pride could be seen. Anyu, the DNA test results were really wrong, that's why I... Lu Chen, when will you stop using these ridiculous excuses? Shen Anyu stood up impatiently, glaring at him. Lu Chen was hurt by the coldness in her eyes. He frantically grabbed at Shen Anyu's sleeve. Anyu, don't go. Shen Anyu pulled her sleeve back, her eyes like they were covered in a layer of ice. Lu Chen, you had so many chances to directly ask me about the truth. But did you? Did you give Yaoyao a chance? Lu Chen had never been scolded so harshly by anyone before. But now, he did not care about his so-called pride, only repeating, Anyu, I really know I was wrong. His voice even sounded a bit sad. Shen Anyu shook her head, questioning him. Lu Chen, when I knelt and begged you to save Yaoyao, did you feel even a little soft-hearted towards me, towards our daughter? Lu Chen seemed to be nailed to the spot by Shen Anyu's words, unable to move. Shen Anyu pointed towards the door and softly said, Lu Chen, don't force me to throw you out. Lu Chen looked at her cold eyes, his heart feeling like it had been ripped open, the old, bloody wounds being reopened and causing pain so intense that he couldn't speak. An endless wave of regret surged through his heart. That night, Lu Chen stayed at a guest house next door. He had a long dream. In the dream, he hadn't listened to his mother's lies and had not done the stupid paternity test. He was by Shen Anyu's side, going to hospitals all over the country, trying to cure Yaoyao. Later, the doctors told them to have a second child and use the cord blood to treat Yaoyao. He and Shen Anyu did what the doctors suggested. That night, Shen Anyu had worn that sexy purple nightgown. He had made love to her multiple times. 10 months later, Shen Anyu gave birth to a son. Later, the son's cord blood saved his Yaoyao. The family of 4 lived together happily. Until he was woken up by the sound of boats in the morning, a smile was still lingering on Lu Chen's lips. However, when he opened his eyes and looked at the unfamiliar room, thinking of the bleak reality of the present, the happy illusion in his dream was like shattered glass, instantly reduced to pieces. With hesitant steps, he went to the guest house next door, the one named Nameless. Shen Anyu had just come downstairs to switch shifts and gave him an impatient glance, her eyes completely devoid of any warmth. Lu Chen, what are you doing here again? These short 9 words completely broke Lu Chen's defenses. He was extremely flustered, looking almost helpless at Shen Anyu. I just came to bring you breakfast. In his hand, he was carrying the breakfast that he had just gone across most of the old town to get. You once told me you wanted to travel here. Before he could finish his sentence, Shen Anyu interrupted him. Lu Chen, what is the point of saying all this to me now? Shen Anyu's expression showed signs of fatigue. It's impossible for things between us to go back to how they were before, just like it's impossible for Yaoyao to come back to life. I know, Lu Chen's eyes were full of pain, his voice begging. Anyu, we can have other children. Just like, the doctor once told us. The doctor had suggested that the couple have a second child, first to use the cord blood to match the first child, who had leukemia. And secondly, in case they couldn't save the first child, the couple would still have a child, and have a new reason to live and hope. Lu Chen, even if we have other children, they will not be Yaoyao. Shen Anyu looked at his face. For a moment, she felt like the man in front of her had become a stranger. Yaoyao was the daughter that she carried for 10 months. When Yaoyao died, it felt like half of her life had been taken away. But in Lu Chen's words, it was merely a flippant, we can have other children. Lu Chen, stop harassing me. Shen Anyu looked at him coldly. At this moment, she couldn't even remember why she had fallen in love with him in the first place. Lu Chen hung his head, like a dog that had been kicked, dejectedly walking away. Wait. Shen Anyu stopped him. Lu Chen paused, turning his head to look at her, full of anticipation. Let's go back to Jiangqing as soon as possible and complete the divorce procedures. No. Lu Chen shook his head, his expression full of pain. Shen Anyu took a deep breath. Our relationship has completely broken down, and we have already signed the divorce agreement. You cheated on me during our marriage and caused a third party to become pregnant. Your doubt about Yaoyao caused the death of our daughter. One by one, she stated these past events. These were the mistakes that Lu Chen had made during their marriage. These past events that had once caused her so much pain were now like boomerangs, coming back to hurt Lu Chen, causing him to regret his actions. If you don't agree, I'll file for divorce in court tomorrow. Then let's see if the judge will grant us a divorce when all this evidence is presented. Lu Chen was deeply stung by her words. He almost wanted to kneel down and beg Shen Anyu. Anyu, I just want a chance to make it up to you. Can't you really give me one more chance? If it were just an affair, perhaps I could give you another chance. Shen Anyu's eyes were full of sadness. But if I forgive you, what does that make of Yaoyao's death? The death of their daughter was like a curse that was separating the two of them, making it impossible for them to ever be together again. If you want to make it up to me, then get a divorce with me. Shen Anyu's voice was very soft. Every time I see you, I think of my daughter who died so tragically. If you don't appear in front of me again, that will be the biggest way to make it up to me. That afternoon, the two of them returned to Jiangqing Civil Affairs Bureau. Shen Anyu and Lu Chen entered the Civil Affairs Bureau one after the other. Once, they had also walked into the Civil Affairs Bureau, side by side. At that time, they were holding hands, their hearts filled with unspeakable joy and excitement. 5 years had passed, and they were still the same two people. But this time, there were no smiles on their faces, and no excitement in their hearts. A tragic relationship had come to an end. When they came out of the Civil Affairs Bureau, the sun was especially bright. The only imperfection was that there was still a cooling-off period before the divorce could be finalized. Shen Anyu took a deep breath of the fresh spring air and softly said to Lu Chen, "Then see you again in a month." Lu Chen's eyes were filled with reluctance. He opened his mouth, as if trying to find an excuse, and softly asked, "When are you going to collect the luggage at home?" Hearing this, Shen Anyu was stunned for a moment. Immediately afterwards, she realized that the luggage that Lu Chen was referring to was her belongings that were in the Lu family's house. She remembered Lu Chen's mother. That woman had stuffed her belongings into several nylon bags like trash and left them on the balcony. "You can just throw it away. I don't need any of it." Lu Chen opened his mouth. At that moment, he felt like what Shen Anyu had discarded wasn't just the old luggage, it also included him. Shen Anyu waved her hand and walked forward. For her, ending this marriage was like gaining a new life. She had no attachment to the past. After making the long trip to Jiangqing, Shen Anyu did not immediately leave. After leaving the Civil Affairs Bureau, she took a taxi to the cemetery. From now on, she probably wouldn't return to Jiangqing often. She wanted to see Yaoyao. Standing in front of Yaoyao's grave, she noticed a bouquet of flowers that was still relatively fresh. Other than her, the only person who would come to pay respects to Yaoyao would be Lu Chen. For some reason, she remembered how Yaoyao had cried and begged her father to come back to see her. The child had cried so pitifully, yet Lu Chen's heart had been so hard. Now that Yaoyao was dead, what was the point of him regretting it now? A broken mirror cannot be put back together, just as the dead cannot be brought back to life. Shen Anyu lit the incense and paid her respects to her daughter. She squatted in front of the tombstone, looking at the photo of Yaoyao that was attached to it. The child in the picture was only 1 year old, smiling sweetly, with a small dimple at the corner of her mouth. She raised her fingertip and touched the little face in the picture, her eyes getting wet. "Yaoyao, Mom is leaving Jiangqing," she softly said to her daughter. "Mom is now in Fengqing, living the life that I once wanted to live. Yaoyao, you will understand Mom, right?" That night, she took a newly opened high-speed train back to Fengqing, back to the guest house that belonged to her. For a long time after that, she put all her energy into the guest house. The busy life allowed her guest house to operate well, and she soon expanded the scale, also dispelling the sadness in her heart. Time was the best healing medicine. Moreover, in those years she spent in Jiangqing, she had given everything she could possibly give to that relationship. She had nothing to be ashamed of. In contrast, Luchin was the one who had much to be ashamed of. Almost every month, he would make the arduous trip to Fengqing. Even though he was very busy at work and even though Shen Anyu would never see him, he insisted on going anyway. This was not only a sign of his longing for Shen Anyu, but also a form of atonement for his past actions. Every time, he would stay at the Tongfu guest house across from the nameless guest house, staring at the stilt houses across the way. 2 years later, when Luchin went there again after the Chinese New Year, he discovered that the name of nameless guest house had changed. The name of the guest house was now called Undelivered. In the past, the guest house had only operated as a guest house, but now, with double its original size, it had newly opened a bar area. A muscular young drummer sat in the guesthouse's main hall, selling drinks and inviting customers. After closing time, the drummer swiftly cleaned up the hall and then joined the guesthouse owner to look at the moon on the guesthouse's roof. After inquiring, Luchin learned that the drummer was only 26 years old, his name was Pei Yi, and he was a local from Fengqing. The sky was clear and bright, and the moon was high in the sky. Although she was only 4 years old, she had a sense of maturity far beyond her age, as she saw her parents growing apart day by day. From the rooftop next door, the laughter of young men and women could be heard occasionally. However, the familiar voice that he loved so much would never again speak to him in such a sweet and coquettish way. Luchin tilted his head back and finished all the wine in the pot, and the next day he bought a ticket to leave Fengqing. He knew that Shen Anyu had completely moved on from the previous relationship and had begun a new life. But he was forever trapped in the same place. Those broken past events were like hills, forever imprinted on the path of his life.